Do you think life is simpler as time evolves? For some, it can be more complicated when facing issues about health, estate plans, probate, long-term care, and more. That's why Attorney-CPA Joe Cordell hosts ElderTalk with TuckerAllen, providing intelligent answers for those thinking about their future. Here's Attorney-CPA Joe Cordell.
Welcome to another episode of ElderTalk. Well, we're continuing our focus on what we know is probably your focus and that of your family and, quite frankly, that of the world right now. And that's this epidemic. We're going through a new phase now, but nonetheless, the future is uncertain. We don't have any experience, Jill, with these sorts of things.
It's unprecedented. It really is.
They come along infrequently, and furthermore, even if they came along more frequently, it seems that they're all different.
Mm-hmm.
So joining us today is Teresa Yao, a popular guest on the show. She's an attorney with TuckerAllen. And we wanted to tie this whole subject in with what we think are one of the most important things to think about during this period of time, and that's planning for the balance of your life and what you want to happen after you're gone. And there's no better time, in my opinion, to think about that than when we're living in an environment where we have greater risk than we'd normally have.
Yeah.
Now, we know those of you who are under 30, it's very improbable, despite what you may hear on the news, and I'm not speaking as a doctor, I just have read other studies and listened to doctors who've been very frank about the fact that the risk to young people is very, very low. And sometimes I think in the well-intentioned effort to stimulate people to take this seriously, I think there's too much focus on those occasional cases where you do hear about it, where somebody's 30 years old and they end up on a ventilator. So we've all heard those cases, but I'm afraid that people misinterpret that and don't realize that those are just incredibly few cases statistically.
And we don't have all the information on those cases. How do we know that that person didn't have underlying medical issues? I mean, there could be all types of factors involved that we just don't know.
Yeah, and this whole thing about what they call comorbidities, things that contribute to death or illness, whenever you come down with this apparently and you're overweight, it turns out that this study done recently in New York City, many of our listeners may be familiar with this. This study was based on a substantial data pool that they have from New York and city as well as the state generally that says that something like, I think it was north of 90% of the people were overweight, certainly north of 80%. It was shocking the extent to which weight seemed to be a contributing factor. And it turned out that of those who died, 93% had a contributing comorbidity. Now, we don't know what that is. I think comorbidity is defined as including being overweight, but like type 2 diabetes, allergies, or some sort of lung problem, pulmonary issues.
Anything where your immune system is compromised for some reason, right?
So those are what are called comorbidities. So it turns out that 93% of the people who died had those. And I think, incidentally, a comorbidity includes probably being over 65. I don't know that, but I think that would be listed as a comorbidity.
Sure.
So isn't that surprising, though, 93% fall in that category?
Yeah, that is a very high number.
Yeah, that is shocking. I guess it kind of makes sense because obesity tends to be linked with a lot of other health conditions. So,
right. Well, even just the typical flu.
Yeah.
You're more at risk if you have those issues.
But it's shocking the high number, the statistical.
Yeah, in one study, I read a guy, John Campbell. He's a doctor who gives regular reports, and he's very popular on YouTube, and he's a very credible physician, and he's been just giving daily reports for some time now. And he's very methodical. And he has these detailed charts that he uses, and he goes through each country around the world. So it's a nice thing for me to look at each night before I go to bed. I'll take a few minutes, or more like 30 minutes, and listen to the update. But one thing that is interesting that those who are researching this disease have found a mystery among many is that the people who are overweight, the probability of their dying from the disease is much greater, even if they don't have any of those things that are often accompany being overweight, such as high blood pressure, heart disease, even cancer, all those things that we know you see more often in people that are overweight. Even if you wipe all those away and you say, well, this is an overweight person who is healthy.
That's so interesting.
That they still show a much higher probability of dying from the disease than somebody who's not. So, and the factor of age is just tremendous. It's tremendous. And that's part of the frustration, I think, around the country is that those for whom the risk is so small, those grab an age, call it under 40. You could probably say under 50, where the probability is so small that all of us are suffering because of this very high risk to a very identifiable portion of our population. I'm talking about those over 65. But you could have legislation that was designed to say if you're so much overweight, and depending on how you define grossly obese, I think that they were talking a BMI of like 35, but that's awfully. You have obesity with a BMI of 30, so and you're overweight certainly with a BMI of 25. So, but you could have legislation that's so well targeted to protect the people who are most likely to suffer, and let the economy otherwise, resume, which benefits everybody, including the people who are in lockdown, those people who are at risk. Right. They benefit from an active economy. So there's such frustration. I never thought I would see this amount of public conflict that we're seeing.
And there certainly is.
Yeah, and Texas. You tell Texans that either they got to give up their guns.
Oh my gosh.
I mean, I can give you a list of 4 or 5 things that, they're sacred.
They aren't standing for it, that's for sure.
And among them would be telling them that they're to go home and stay there. Some Americans generally don't respond well. And that was the reason some projections from Europe at the outset of this crisis was that America would fare very poorly because of our temperament. Our temperament is to be non-compliant. After all, if you think about it, the people who got on ships and came here were by definition the people who were rebellious and rejected the rules regarding the Church of England. They were persecuted in many ways. So in a sense, we're a nation of rebels.
Yeah, we were founded on civil unrest, I would say.
Yeah, and liberty.
Like the American spirit, right?
Yes,
it is.
Very much so.
And those who've come in the last 200, 300, 400 years since then have fit the same profile. Because there are people who leave their countries and they come here because they're rejecting what's there and they're willing to take risks. They're assuming risk. So that's a profile of Americans. And I think as a result that this lockdown will probably go more poorly here than in many countries. But, we don't know. It's really interesting. Sweden has virtually no significant rules, meaning that they're a very permissive regime right now regarding this coronavirus. Right. And they've essentially adopted a system very similar to that of what England started out with. England's strategy at first was to keep it fairly loose. That means not that they didn't have any rules, but that the rules were very limited. You lock down the people who are old and have the comorbidities. Others, you have them follow certain rules, and you have limits as to how many can gather in a particular place. So it was a very common sense but relatively permissive regime for dealing with this virus. But I think they got spooked. They had a spike, which you would predict incidentally, because this policy is designed to allow all of your ventilators and your ICU beds to be fully used at all times, meaning you don't want to have people waiting out in the hallways. And on the other hand, paradoxical, strange as it sounds, you don't want to have empty ICU beds. And that sounds like an odd statement, but what it means is that you want the virus to work its way through the population, but you want it to work its way at a controlled level so that your healthcare system can manage to provide good care to the people who need it. And
it's not overwhelmed. The system isn't overwhelmed.
But you also want to approach it at a pace where you're getting through the pandemic as well. Yeah.
Right. So you want to move forward, which means letting the virus spread, but you want to assure you protect the people who are likely to die from it. So you keep them locked down, and you want to be sure that you don't have so many serious cases that you can't give them the medical care they need. So I think England got spooked early on, or the UK, and they decided that they would back off from that, and they started following the more conventional approach, the majority plan.
Right.
So the majority plan, maybe we do know that it keeps the virus from spreading, but we don't know whether it turns out to have an exit strategy that we can count on, nor do we know whether the price we pay in lives resulting from the economic holocaust is worth it, because no one is assigning any life values to the other side of the scales, which is the economic devastation.
And and just what it has done to the economy. And, speaking about people not standing for this, there's that case right here in West County with the gym. I believe it's called the House of Pain, and they decided to open up against the stay-at-home orders. And, they have really been facing some backlash about that.
Yeah, you're starting to see that happen around the country. You're seeing these cases that appear on the news in the evening, this handful of cases where people are being defiant. Of course, Elon Musk, he's kind of a wild man anyway.
Right.
He's an interesting character, but he says he's opening despite the rules of, is it Alameda County or wherever he is? But he apparently, according to the rules of the state of California, he's okay to reopen what is his only car assembly plant in the United States, in California. According to the laws of California, it's permissible, but the way California works is each county can have more strict rules, but they can't have less strict. So it turns out that this county that he's in, and I'm going to say Alameda, but whatever it is, it turns out that they've decided in their wisdom. Now, these are local council members that have no expertise on this subject, and they've decided in their wisdom that they want him to stay closed. So, or at least they will tell you that they're working out a plan, but the effect is that he's not open, and he hadn't been open for some time, and so he's finally decided that he's done it in two ways. He filed a lawsuit against it for, I guess, some due process violation, maybe a takings violation under the Constitution, and then he's also just going ahead and opening and defying them to take sort of police steps to stop him. So I think that policies like this, a lockdown, is so contrary to the Constitution of this country. It probably comes as no surprise to those living under Putin. It's another day. So some dictate or comes out that announces people aren't to go out that day, and they figure, oh, it's Tuesday. It's just another day. And the reality, and China too. China has a history of being pretty martial in their solutions, and I think that anything draconian that China announces, I think they're likely to get strong compliance. I mean, Wuhan, I don't think we know how brutal that was.
Oh,
I was, insane how much that was just devastating.
right.
But yeah, I remember I have some family relatives in China, and they had stories about how everybody had to stay within the house, and only one person is allowed to leave the house every week, and they have to have a permission slip or something to go grocery shopping.
Wow.
And then it was very much controlled.
So what happened when they got to the grocery store?
I don't know the specifics of how to deal with it, but they even controlled how many people could leave the house, and then for what purposes that they're leaving the house.
And I think
for.
people with diagnoses, they were boarded the front door of the house, so you physically couldn't leave.
They boarded up?
Yeah, I mean there
Wow.
are journalist photos or videos of them actually boarding up the front of the house to be sure that those, and then many, though, in the early stages of the Wuhan, or as it gained momentum, they took all those people and put them inside gymnasiums, or the equivalent of a gymnasium, and they slept on, their space was 2 feet by, 6 feet, whatever was required for a human body to spread out and sleep, and they were across the floor of this gym, this was the way they kept it from spreading. And to them, it was far less important whether that person was ever treated. Their public policy concern was to assure that these people didn't spread it. And if they could give them some treatment, fine. And I'm sure they gave them something, but it was very primitive, I don't doubt.
Right.
But it wasn't their priority. Their public policy was focused on not spreading it. So if you had the misfortune of coming down with it, you were on your own. But did it work in terms of stopping the spread? Well, yeah. I mean, I think it looks like it worked pretty
Right.
But the West would never tolerate.
Oh, no. Could you imagine something like that here? There is no way.
Oh, my gosh. Yeah. No.
Thankfully.
Yes.
Thankfully,
yes.
we would not tolerate that. So let's talk a little bit about what this may mean for those of us who are getting by on a day-to-day basis. Many of you are unemployed now. We know that. The percentages have gone up, but the last we've heard, the most recent statistic is 16.4% unemployment. We expect that to double, at least get closer to 25. I don't want to catastrophize here, but I don't think it's catastrophizing at all to have a prognosis that perhaps we'll get to 25%.
I think it's likely.
The Great Depression was 25.4%. I think that when you look at what's happening in industries, manufacturing in particular, are shutting down facilities. They did the furloughs at first. They took what financial support was available to them, and I assume with the best of intentions. But now many of them are sending announcements that at the end of July, at the end of the period that they've committed to regarding PPP funding at least, that they're going to close down these manufacturing facilities. And a long list of them were in a Wall Street Journal article recently. So it is real, and the idea of a snapback is just not realistic. And I'm not somebody who's given to gloomy, ominous, futuristic scenarios. But at the same time, I think it's naive to think that we can have this devastation to small and medium-sized and large.
Right.
Small, medium, and large. There's nobody immune to this.
No.
It's not like 2007 and 2008. This is very different. And in this case, I think that there's going to be a lot of unemployment. I think that there will be some financial hardships, and I think that we can expect the virus to kind of come and go till we get a vaccine. But now my guess, obviously, all of you have heard news reports. You've read on this. I read on it quite a bit. Perhaps many of you do as well. So you know that you see different opinions out there. But I think there's a consensus among the best informed that we are going to see this roll in and out until we get a vaccine. And then that assumes that there is no mutation that requires a different vaccine.
Yeah, and that's what really I think is scary is the mutation. I mean, what is that going to look like?
Yeah, I think didn't recently they just found, because for a large part they were like, oh, children were spared from this pandemic, but then out there finding this mysterious illness that's linked to COVID and then affecting the children.
Right.
So I don't know, the mutations could be some.
And I agree with you. I think it's going to take a long time for us to rebound from this.
Yeah.
Because the devastation just was so quick.
Yeah, and I'm a little surprised when I talk to people who ask my opinion regarding, perhaps where some of their funds should be placed. Of course, let me first disclaim the idea that I'm not a financial planner, nor am I an investment analyst, but I do follow the market, and I have to tell you, I'm surprised at how buoyant some segments of the market have been, particularly the NASDAQ, there's right now this surge of popularity for small companies. But you also have, this handful of companies that have been the huge beneficiary of this crisis. And they call them the FANG companies, and perhaps you add to that Microsoft, but FANG would be like Facebook, Amazon, Google, Netflix, Apple. I mean, these stock prices account for something north of 35 to 40% of the movement in their particular exchanges or where they're listed. In other words, what appears to be a pretty optimistic market, it is pretty optimistic, incidentally, but much of it is explained in terms of these particular stocks. But even when you look at like the Dow is suspiciously optimistic. The numbers have returned nowhere near to 30,000. Can you remember those days? Just a couple months ago, 30,000.
Yeah.
And now the last I looked, we were at 24.
Right.
I'm a little surprised. How can we be at 24 with what we know lies ahead? We know that the hospitality industry, we know that movie theaters, that travel, recreation, the sort of shock to our systems will forbid many people from returning, at least for the balance of this year, in a significant way to a broad swath of our economy's products and services.
Right.
We know this.
Yeah.
And I look at the market and I wonder, I don't expect a crash like in the Great Depression, where, you know how low stocks went in the Great Depression?
Hello.
The Dow went down 92%.
Oh my
92%.
Wow.
Now this was at the depth. I think the
Yeah,
depth of the
wow.
of the stock market in the recession of the Great Depression was around 1932. Then it started its comeback. So I don't expect anything like that here. I
Hope
do
not.
think our unemployment rate may reach that, but it
Yeah.
doesn't mean the stock market will. But for the stock market to only gone down as little as it has, when the economy has been officially declared closed almost.
Right.
So anybody who's asking my advice, and thankfully there aren't a whole lot, but you know, I warn them that, you know, I think it's better to be on the sidelines right now than sitting in the market. I would rather be betting on the market going further down than betting on the market going further up. And if you stay in the market now, your bet is that it's going further up, or you're betting that it's going to be a short ride down, and then you start back up soon. And I don't think that's realistic either. So what can we talk about more authoritatively? We wanted to kind of start out kind of discussing the landscape, discussing kind of the circumstances in which we all, to varying extents, find ourselves. And to place that in the context of, you know, to what extent have you planned for this brave new world, or this very uncertain new world?
Yeah. And I do think this pandemic, I've said this before, it does serve as a wake-up call of the importance of having a plan, having an estate plan.
And, you know, it's a topic that nobody wants to talk about, and yet it's one of those critical items that a box needs to be checked right now. You need to have that box checked. And the older you are, the more important it is. But even for younger people, you know, if you have children, are your probabilities much better? Yes, your probabilities in terms of dying from a coronavirus is much better. But still, even with much lower probabilities, the consequences are so dire for your wife and children, or your husband and kids, that you can't afford to take chances like that. And there's no point in it. Planning is just one of those things that responsible people do. And if there's anything that should remind us about that, it should be what we're going through right now. The world is going through.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's do this, though. Let's talk about, when we say planning, people are thinking, planning in what way? Should I be buying a funeral plan, a burial plan? No, we're not being morbid here.
Yeah, no doom and gloom.
Yeah, right. The focus of planning, in my opinion, is first on the balance of your life, because that affects everybody. It doesn't affect just you. It affects, you know, your children, maybe your adult children. It affects others in your life. So estate planning, from my perspective, should deal first and foremost with the balance of your life. And then secondly, perhaps not a distant second, but secondly, is to assure that the things that you've accumulated in this world, that those go to the purposes and the people for which you desire.
Right.
That's number two, though. And many people mix those up. They think, oh, I need to go have a will. Well, it may be true they need a will, but it's truer that they need to have something in place to assure their care is provided for the balance of their life.
Yeah, that's most important.
So let me toss that to you, Teresa. In other words, so if we think about, somebody walks in and says, well, gee, I don't have anything in place. So kind of walk through kind of what that conversation's like.
Yeah, so when we have people come into our office and when they book that consultation, essentially what I just ask 3 primary questions. I would say, tell me about your people, because it is about your life. So the important people in your life, yourselves and any loved ones, especially the ones you want to include in estate planning picture. And then I ask about the different assets they have. And I don't get into too specifics unless they're looking for either like long-term care calculations. But I ask for the different types of assets they have, how they own it. And then I ask a more philosophical question saying, okay, well, in an ideal world, how would you envision having your assets transferred? Like, what would you want the flow of your assets to look like? And so based on the information that I gather from those 3 primary questions, then we kind of talk about the different instruments that are available in estate planning that is most appropriate for them. Many times that is a trust, because a trust gives you that flexibility and gives you a lot more control, and it helps you avoid probate, and distributes your assets in a way that helps take care of your loved ones. But in the consultation, we also talk about the other documents we include, because we do things in packages at TuckerAllen. So we don't just create a trust for you and it's one and done. We create wills that work with your trust, and we also create powers of attorney. And those are the documents that really prioritize the balance of your life, because they make sure that you gain back some of that control over how you want your care to be handled. And
so what do people often do regarding, let's say you talk first about, well, what if you were to have a stroke, or you were to come down with this terrible virus and suddenly you are on a respirator, or choose the scenario. It could be simply a heart attack that leaves you incompetent, but alive. It may be alive for a long time, and maybe even able to recover.
Right.
So whenever we're describing these scenarios, they don't always involve somebody who's had something happen where they become incapable of managing their affairs, only to degenerate and die. Sometimes things like this happen. Strokes are notorious for this.
Yeah.
You know, you're out of commission for maybe months or even a couple of years.
It's a temporary situation, but you can bounce back.
Yeah, you build new. I don't want to get too ahead out of my field of expertise, but the brain is able to recover. So new synapses fire, or there are new connections that form in neurons, and people over time. But it takes time, and that can happen to any of us. If you're listening to my voice now, especially if you're over 60 years old, then it could happen to any of us. And often they happen to people who look fit. And there are genetic factors and a variety of things. So sometimes strokes are hard to predict. And when they happen, though, suddenly your bank accounts, your retirement qualifications and eligibility, and all the forms that people have to submit to arrange for insurance payments and coverage, as well as Social Security, all those things that may need attention, rent, utilities, the list goes on and on. You have a life that requires your full-time attention. And yet, until you sit down and think about what all it is required to run your life, you can easily forget that it requires you personally, your signature, and without it, everything comes to a stop. That's the good and bad news about the privacy laws of America. The good news is, they've stiffened up considerably over the last 20 years. The bad news is, if you're not around to run things, then nothing's going to happen until somebody goes to court and there's a hearing set. And right now, are they doing hearings in the downtown?
So right now, no. Courts are largely still closed. They just are kind of operating at an emergency basis only mode. So that means that if you had to have some sort of emergency hearing, you're going to have to contact, I assume, the clerk of the court, and they would set up what might be a Zoom conference. But there's going to be lawyers, there's going to be doctors. I mean, it's not a simple matter, especially under these conditions now, to be able to get attention. So meanwhile, you're lying in perhaps an unconscious state, or insensate in some sense of the word, and meanwhile, your affairs need attention, and nobody has the ability to do anything for you.
Yeah, their hands are tied, and that's why it's so important to have a plan like this in place where you have someone taking care of your affairs when you can't, even if it's only temporary.
Yeah.
And it really is shockingly simple. I mean, you would expect, okay, a remedy for something like that, that's going to be complicated, and that's going to require, a lot of professionals to be involved. And the answer is no. This is one of the easiest things to fix. And that's the reason it's inexcusable. I'll use that word. It's inexcusable for someone to allow themselves to be in that position without a document where they pick the person who manages their life, as opposed to the family having to hire lawyers, go to court, and let the judge pick. The judge will pick who will run your life. You.com or You Inc., it will suddenly be in the hands of the person that the judge chooses. Now, it may be the person you would have chosen.
But it may not have been.
But it may not be.
Yeah.
So it's such an easy thing to fix.
And it's so fast to create one of these documents, too.
So describe the issues that you walk through whenever you're talking to someone about, let's get this durable power of attorney, which is the primary tool I guess we use, this durable power of attorney. Go through some of the issues.
So yeah, the first thing we do is we ask who they are considering, right? Because that's the whole point of setting these documents up, appointing an agent. So we ask them kind of who they're thinking of as appointing as their first choice agent, and then also having successor agents built into place in case something were to happen to that first choice. And in consideration of the people that they're picking, we recommend that it's normally somebody who is local, just because, especially if it's like healthcare, it's really important for that for your agent to be able to assess kind of in person what you're going through, and also it's probably easier for them to access your finances and help you get that done. And we also consider age. For age, normally you would want somebody who's younger than you or around the same age. Preferably not somebody who's older, just because you want these documents and this appointment to last as long as possible. And of course, this is the most important one. You want to make sure you're appointing somebody that you trust, right? You don't want to give them this broad authority over your finances and over your body when you can't speak for yourself. So trust is a really big
huge
one, right?
Yeah. That they kind of share your values, too. Yeah,
especially for the healthcare one, but even for finances.
Now, Teresa, what happens if you have a client that has, say, 3 children, and they say, I want all 3 of my children in on making these decisions?
Let me tell you, I have heard that before.
It's very common.
It is very common. Okay, now, can that be done?
So yes, you can pick co-agents. You can have multiple people acting together at the same level, like as your first choice or your second choice. I normally advise against that because, especially when you're not in a position to make decisions for yourself or you're unconscious, it can be a really emotionally intense time, especially for people who love you. And if they're differing opinions in such an emotionally intense context, it can get really ugly. And you don't want that to happen between your kids. So normally I kind of like to steer people towards, saying, I know you love your children equally, but just think about maybe who is the person who's most accustomed to handling finances, or just like who is the person that's not based on how much you love them, but just like how appropriate they are for this position. And these documents are just legal, right? These are legal documents that give you that authority and give you that control back in handling your life. But you still expect your kids to talk to each other in these times. So even if some kids are not appointed, you expect them to have these conversations so that everybody's opinions are kind of weighed in.
Now, what about in the situation where the parents put on a ventilator and it comes time to decide, and you have 3 children that are all acting as agents? 2 of them don't want it, 1 does. I mean, how would that work?
I mean, if they're all the same tier, that's why we try to recommend saying, hey, make sure you just, especially with healthcare, I think it's really important to have an order and as much as possible have individuals.
Yeah.
I mean, does that ever happen? And what is it, like a vote? I mean, without sounding morbid, but
if you have 3 kids, they do paper, rock, scissors.
Okay, of course they do.
Yeah, no, I mean, it really is. It really is a common problem because often, as Teresa's saying, you have people who come in and they have several children, and they're very sensitive to one of these children feeling somehow disrespected or perhaps thinking my mother and father don't trust me as much at my judgment. And it's not unusual for kids, one or more kids, to think that anyway. So whenever this issue comes up, then they're sensitive to what mom and dad decide to do. So there is often a lot of the pressure, just like you're describing. It's not unusual for them to push. And just like Teresa's saying, we tend to push back a little bit, but not too hard, because the bottom line is if they want a unanimous decision, certainly you can do that and it's legally valid. But as Teresa said, it's probably going to result in a deadlock. And so a judge would have to decide it. Now, you could have a tiebreaker. There's lots of creative solutions. That's what's wonderful about these documents is they're not real expensive to do at all. And yet you can do something to meet a particular need. So let's say if you had 3 children and you were very sensitive that they all have a voice, for all these things. So we could do that, and then we could say to you, okay, but is there someone who you would trust to be a tiebreaker? And that's a little clunky, but it's not as clunky as not having a tiebreaker.
Yeah.
So there's always ways to give remedies. And incidentally, you should always have an odd number of kids if you're thinking about.
I was going to say, what if you have 4 kids?
When you're thinking about estate planning as you're young, be sure and have an odd number of kids. But whenever you have an equal number, then you have this democracy of 2. And for example, and suddenly there's a thumbs up and a thumbs down. So I think that what works best is really when you can give like the senior child. That's usually easily explained. They're the senior child, and since primogeniture, for 1,000 years we've thought, the firstborn, yes, they get certain privileges. Now the biggest problem I've found is often that's satisfying in the family dynamics, right? The firstborn. But when the firstborn is the sort of ne'er-do-well, and suddenly mom and dad say, well, if I chose the one, and this is normally, tell me, Teresa, if you found this, more often when I've had this sort of pushback conversation, it usually was in a context where the one that was really capable was like the youngest.
Oh, yeah.
And so the parents just can't bring themselves. I just can't give that power to him and shortchange our older children in that way. They wouldn't understand.
I mean, we've definitely seen that happen. And then what I like to say in those cases is, first of all, you're my client, so my advice is you need to do what's best for you, right? That's first and foremost what's most important.
And for the kids, arguably. Yeah. It's really best for them, even though they don't like it.
Yeah, and for the kids. And what I like to tell them is, yes, today we're deciding what's on the paper, like legally, but while like you're here in front of me, you're still healthy, you have the capacity to make this decision, and what I tell them is after we execute this document, nothing's stopping you from talking to your children beforehand, before you become incapacitated, and say, hey, in this durable power of attorney, this is how I have it set up, and here is my rationale, just so like everybody knows where you're coming from, and it's not coming from a place of unfairness.
Right.
Or
but that's still... I mean, because if you tell them the truth about the rationale is, look, I think little Timmy is the only one responsible enough among all of you. But no, you're right about the importance of sitting down and having this conversation before you pass away. That's something that so many ugly fights that have happened.
Yeah.
And this includes about how you dispose of your stuff after you're gone, not just when you're incompetent. But so many of those, I'm convinced, could have been headed off if mom and dad or dad had sat down and said, look, this is what I'm doing and this is why I'm doing it. I think later when the kids are shocked to hear it and they think mom or dad could not have really wanted this. There's been manipulation. There's been undue influence.
Yeah.
There's been fraud.
That's a whole other bag of legal problems that
you
wouldn't want your kids to get involved in. So
no, and allegations of duress. And what makes it all the more problematic is often in those situations, the parent has had one child involved. Now, it doesn't mean the child is guilty of any undue influence, but it often turns out that the child that's with them a lot, that's taking care of them,
right?
It as so often happens when you read these cases that end up in court, you go through and read these appellate opinions, and the facts always are just filled with red flags. Red flags like that child made the appointment all these details become important. Who makes the appointment with the lawyer?
With the lawyer,
Who
right.
selected the lawyer? So it's not unusual for if Susan is the child who's in town and taking care of mom and dad more, then it kind of makes sense if they want to do their estate planning, they're going to have Susan find a lawyer. Well, but what the record reflects is that Susan was, and when she's asked in a deposition, 5 years later after mom and dad have passed, and so there's a deposition or a hearing, and Susan's asked, did you select the attorney? And so Susan might say, yes, I did. And how did your parents get to the attorney's office for the estate planning? Well, it turns out Susan drove them. And then they ask, well, who sat in on the meeting with the parents? And this is really damning when it turns out that Susan sat in on the meeting.
That's going to look bad on Susan.
Yeah. So at that point, the burden has shifted. And so now the burden is with those who are promoting the will, who are saying the will is valid. It's suddenly the burden of proof on them is to prove that there was no undue influence. And that's a hard thing to prove a negative. But the burden of proof has shifted based on those basic facts where somebody had opportunity. Oh, and they received a disproportionate share of the outcome, which is the reason you're in the litigation to begin with.
To begin with, right.
So when all those factors come together under Missouri law, those three factors, then it's enough to shift the burden. And something like that can actually mean that your estate planning is thrown out. It's thrown out. And suddenly what kicks in is the intestate rules. So those are the sorts of details that all too often people who are doing their planning, and I'll make this as a more global comment for people thinking about this. And it sounds self-serving, I get that, but if you were my mother, brother, sister, son, whatever, I would tell you the same thing. And that's that when you order a form from Zoom or anywhere else, I don't want to pick on, is it Zoom?
Legal Zoom?
Legal Zoom, yeah.
You can tell how I've been communicating a lot lately.
Haven't we all?
So, and I don't want to pick on Legal Zoom. So if you use a form, forms they're just not the opportunity for you to know the things that you've learned just in the last 20 minutes as we've been talking here. There's no one to explain those things to you. Now, you may get a set of instructions. Maybe you can patch together some YouTube videos. But the bottom line is, isn't this more important than trying to save even $1,000? I don't want to minimize $1,000, but I just grabbed a number. It could be much less. It could be more. So, but the whole idea is I'm real impatient with people who have something in this world. I don't mean they're rich. I mean they have something in this world that they spent a lifetime working on. And suddenly they're wanting to order a form for $30 or whatever it is and to handle things like we've been talking about.
Right.
It just doesn't make any sense.
You need a legal expert to do that. And, most of us aren't legal experts, and that's why we go to attorneys.
Yeah. It's
to help us navigate through all of this, because it can get complicated.
So from the standpoint of creating these documents, we talked about, first that segment about the balance of your life, providing for care, and we talked about just a few of these issues that you went through, Teresa, and we could have gone through more. So it doesn't mean this document is real complicated. It just means there's a lot to think about. Turns out that the document is not very expensive, but heaven forbid that you just order a form and fill in the blanks, because you're going to miss a lot of stuff. And there are some boxes to check, et cetera, but there's no substitute for having the conversation like we just talked about. And the similar thing, times 10, is the idea that you have your estate planning done through some sort of form, because you just wouldn't know these things, and you wouldn't know that, if your daughter ordered the document online, if she paid for it with her credit card, things that could be done innocently.
Right.
But they wouldn't know. So if you plug this particular hole we talked about, my point is there are many other holes we're not talking about. And that's the reason, self-serving as it sounds, I would give this to those I care most about in the world, is a very stern insistence that the smart thing to do is to go to a lawyer who does this sort of thing to have it done. And if it's not TuckerAllen, that's fine. I prefer it to be TuckerAllen. But the point is, I'm giving you the advice I'd give you if I cared about you, and I would just say a good lawyer who does this sort of thing.
And something we didn't touch on, Teresa, congratulations are in order. She is now a Mrs.
Thank you, guys.
Recently
Yes.
married last weekend, correct?
Yes. Thank you.
Congratulations.
Congratulations.
We are so happy for you.
Thank you.
Yes. And so until next week, I hope this has been helpful, interesting, and educational. This has been Elder Talk. Take care.
You've been listening to Elder Talk with TuckerAllen, providing intelligent answers for those thinking about their future, with Attorney-CPA Joe Cordell. Sponsored by TuckerAllen, your estate and elder law advisors. For more information, visit TuckerAllen.com. Listen again next Saturday for another edition of Elder Talk with TuckerAllen. The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely on advertisements.